Good evening and welcome to our third session of today's conference under the title Competing Memory and Heritage Reconstruction. I would like to welcome our speakers for today. I will start to my left, Craig Larkin and Enra Rudolf. They're going to present a paper on memory, violence, and post-conflict reconstruction, reimagining Mosul. Dr. Craig Larkin is a reader in Middle East politics and peace and conflict studies at the Department of War Studies, King's College, London. He is the director of the Center for the Study of Divided Societies and research lead on memory and conflict for the FCDO-funded Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends research program. His publications include Memory and Conflict in Lebanon, The Struggle for Jerusalem's Holy Places, and the Alawis of Syria, War, Faith, and Politics in the Levant. He has researched and written extensively on Islamist movements, urban violence, and ethno-religious conflict throughout the Middle East. Craig holds a PhD in Middle East Studies from the University of Exeter. He previously studied Arabic at Damascus University and worked in community development projects in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. Dr. Enna Rudolf is a senior research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for the Study of Divided Societies at King's College, London. With the XCEPT consortium, she's analyzing the implications of identity politics and the mobilization of violent memories in conflict-afflicted borderlands. As part of her PhD thesis at the War Studies Department of King's College London, Rudolf focused the hybridization of security sector governance, examining Iraq's paramilitary umbrella, the popular mobilization forces, and their quest for legitimacy within the state, and received her master's degree in political science and Islamic studies in 2012 at the University of Heidelberg, specializing in conflict resolution, peace building, and political Islam. In addition to her fieldwork in Iraq, she lived in Libya, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, and Palestine for several years. Enna has also represented the BMW Foundation in the Middle East and North Africa region and is a partner at the Candid Foundation, an independent Berlin-based think tank working on political, social, and cultural challenges facing Muslim communities in the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Our second speaker is Gruia Bădescu, correct? Okay. His paper is titled Reshaping Space, Reshaping Memory, International Actors and Post-War Reconstruction from Berlin to the Balkans. Bădescu is a research fellow at the, I cannot pronounce, thank you very much, University of Constance. He holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and before Constance, he was a lecturer and research associate at the University of Oxford. His research examines urban and architectural interventions in the aftermath of political ruptures, focusing on post-war urban reconstruction and memorialization after political violence. I messed up. His research on post-war reconstruction has examined experiences in the former Yugoslavia and in Lebanon, also in dialogue with a comparative lens. He co-edited the book Synchronous Past, Transforming Heritage in the Former Yugoslavia, and is now completing a monograph tracing the relationship between architectural reconstruction and dealing with the past in the 20th century. At Constance, he first held an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, hosted by Jan and Aleida Assmann, and is now leading a research group on urban imaginaries after political ruptures, which has a focus on cosmopolitan imaginaries and syncretic placemaking in cities with ethno-religious diversity. He's a convener of the Memory, Space and Place Working Group of the Memory Studies Association, part of the European Action Group on Dissonant Heritage, and an active contributor to the Arab-German Youth Academy Heritage Program. Our third speaker is Mounir Sabeh Affaki. His paper is titled Memories Collective Yet Divided, the Potentials of Post-War Memorial Architecture in Aleppo. Mounir is an architect and a researcher. He holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Coimbra, Portugal. His research interests touch on the topics of built heritage, memory, and public spaces. His doctoral thesis responds to the reality of his hometown, Aleppo. It discusses the potentials of architecture and urban planning as tools for post-war social reconciliation through interdisciplinary research, bridging social studies and architecture. Currently, Mounir is a postdoctoral researcher at the Czech Technical University in Prague. He is working on post-war Czech architecture with the mentorship of Professor Petr Vorlik, head of the Department of History of Architecture. His latest article, Lost Between Legalization and Application, a critical reading of Czech post-war architectural conversation policies, was published by the International Journal of Heritage Studies. our final, oh no, sorry, one more section about Mounir. He was also involved in several research groups with focus on the Syrian context, working on post-war reconstruction, housing and urban planning and development issues, for which presentations and lectures were conducted, workshops attended, and research outputs were circulated in several international conferences and seminars. Our final speaker for today is Gehan Selim. Gehan is the Hoffman Wood Chair in Architecture at the University of Leeds. She is the Deputy Director at Leeds Social Sciences Institute and was Fellow of the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice from 2017 to 2018. She is leading the Architecture and Urbanism Research Group at the University of Leeds, with her research covering interdisciplinary methods, bridging between architecture, urban politics, and digital heritage. She is leading several funded research projects with an extensive portfolio of empirical research in the global south. She is the author of Unfinished Places, An Architecture, Space and Memory of Resurrection in Northern Ireland, and her paper is titled Co-Producing Memory, the Youth's Vision of Beirut's Contested Past. I will now start with our first paper. The floor is yours.
It's on? No, it's on now. Thank you very much to our moderator. I think we give you far too long bios. That's the longest introduction I've heard in a while, but it's a pleasure to be here today. Let me just try to click on. Just wait till technology boots up. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today in Doha, Qatar, with Dr. Rudolf, and I are presenting this paper on our ongoing research in Iraq. This is part of an EXEP project, a 5-year FCDO funded, looking at the activators and inhibitors of conflict. And where this research really sits is we're quite interested in the intersection between post-war reconstruction, heritage restoration, and intercommunal cohesion. How traumatic memory has a legacy on the post-war city. Now, it raises multiple questions. I think these are questions that have already been addressed and have already come up, but we are going to be looking in particular at Moslawi narratives and oral histories, because that's what we've been researching for the last year. And the question is, what role should memory play in reconstruction? What should be preserved? Who actually gets to tell what remains and what should be buried? Can heritage preservation actually revive traditions of coexistence? Does this require a prioritizing of plural shared spaces, or rather more inclusive policies that represent all aspects of society? And finally, one that perhaps hasn't been touched on as much so far in this conference, and that's to do with traumatic memory. How should violence be embedded within the sort of post-conflict society? Should it be memorialized? Should it be silenced? Should we forget? And this leads to questions of social grievance and competitive narratives of victimhood. Now, these are very difficult questions. There's no easy answers, but what we wanted to do was to look and to research Mosul in Iraq as a site to understand this post-conflict reconstruction. Now, this is Iraq's second largest city, 3.7 million population, the capital of the Nineveh province bordering the KRG, an ancient, rich, pluralistic city split by the Tigris River, and very diverse, with a majority Sunni Arab population, but also substantial majorities of Kurds, Turkmen, Christian, Yazidi, Shabak, numerous ethnic and religious communities that have been there for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. But post-2003, with the Allied invasion and the overthrow of Saddam, we see Mosul become a power vacuum and the rise of Sunni insurgency. And from post-2003, even at that time, we see displacement of ethnic minorities and the emergence of a shadow government armed militia of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, later to be replaced by Daesh, Islamic State, who took over in 2014. And they made Mosul the capital of their Islamic Caliphate. It also became the hub of, we can see here, ISIS network spreading from Mosul right over through the border into Syria and Raqqa. And the reign of terror was for 3 years. They were finally liberated, or Mosul was liberated on the 21st of July 2017 by Iraqi forces and al-Hashd. Now, ISIS' reign and battle has left a devastated Mosul, from which almost 1 million of the population have been displaced. Estimates put it at 60 to 70% of the city's infrastructure was destroyed, and an estimated $1.1 billion would just be, is estimated to actually rebuild just the western part of this city. 6 out of 44 districts were completely destroyed. You can see just the urban devastation. What's interesting, one of the first monuments to actually be erected in Mosul was this monument in recognition of the Iraqi workers that cleared thousands of tons of rubble. Very dangerous jobs because there was IEDs, there was unexploded bombs, and this was one of the first monuments erected in post-ISIS Mosul. Now, ISIS strategy didn't just leave a legacy of urban destruction, but I would argue they deliberately enacted herbicide. Now, herbicide, Martin Coward argues, it entails the destruction of buildings as the constitutive element of urbanity. First, the conditions of possibility of heterogeneity are destroyed, followed by the imposition of homogeneity. So this is a targeted, deliberate killing of the city, not just a byproduct of violence, but a purposeful targeting of a cosmopolitan plural experience. And that was the legacy of ISIS. Not only the forced expulsion of religious and ethnic minorities, but the deliberate targeting of heritage. We can see UN Habitat in one of their recent reports have marked those heritage sites, those religious sites that have been destroyed in Mosul and wider Nineveh. 37 Islamic mosques, tombs, 35 churches, monasteries, 22 Yazidi shrines, 10 Shabak shrines in the Nineveh plain. Now the question, and I think this is an interesting, not just for the Reconstruction project, but also the question of how to deal with a post-conflict city. How do you reverse a rupture in society that there's been huge amount of displacement? How do you restore plural multiculturalism to a city that has been drained of its minorities? Now that's the question. I'm trying to get to the sort of conceptualization. If herbicide is the killing of a city, how do you bring about its resurrection? We talk a lot about reconstruction, but I don't think it is really reconstruction, because the city has been through a violent death and the scars still remain. You can't just rebuild it anew. There will still be a legacy. This is a resurrection of Mosul, and it's a difficult question. So the research entailed 50 interviews with residents throughout Mosul, from leaders, sheikhs, politicians, activists, scholars, heads of NGOs across different religious, ethnic, gender divides. It was a unique opportunity to interview these communities and to talk through how they imagined their city should be rebuilt, but also the whole nostalgia around what Mosul actually represents. Interviews were conducted in Arabic, online, some in person, and it was really oral histories around their personal experiences. I want to, Inna and I will look at 3 key findings, and I will look at the narratives, and then I will look more at the sites. And I think the first one that we see is the very contested memory narratives. While there's a lot of emphasis on the cosmopolitan plural past, I think this also needs to be tempered by memories of urban fractures, inequalities, and communal suspicions. It's not enough just to focus on what united Mosul, but also part of what led to the fall and the overwhelming of the city. So there must be opportunities for minority voices to be reflected in this recollection, but also in the rehabilitation of the city. Secondly, we would argue there needs to be a balancing of memorialization projects. While UNESCO have focused on the key symbolic churches and mosques, there also needs to be acknowledgement of local sites and spaces that have been imbued with symbolic significance. And some of these are sites of massacres and atrocities. What do you do with those sites? Do you just build over the top of them? Or is there some type of acknowledgement? Should there be some form of memorialization? And thirdly, reconstruction requires international support, but it must empower national actors. There needs to be greater capacity building with Iraqi National Heritage Institute that include all of Moslawi society, not just the society that remains in Mosul, but also those displaced in the outskirts, in the rural enclaves. So just focusing very briefly on Mosul's memory debates, one of the most important and significant narrative is this idea of nostalgic coexistence. And it came up in many of the stories from Moslawis who spoke about religious tolerance, about visiting each other's church and mosque during Eid and festivals, to economic cooperation in the local souks, to intercommunal solidarity. And there's a real sense that this is also tied into identity, that it's not just about the reconstruction of a city, it's a reconstruction of Moslawi identity. You know, as one interviewee said, we want to rebuild Mosul as an idea, not just a physical structure. I think that's important. Sometimes we can dissect cultural heritage away from its urban environment, and that's linked to the idea of who you are as a person and how you fit within that community. It's about personal recovery, belonging, and home. In another interview, he said, our generation today should work hard and strive to revive Mosul and bring back its soul like before. So there's this idea of a harmonious cosmopolitan past. When pressed, Moslawis, though, could not really name the specific periods when there was a harmonious coexistence. That became interesting when we spoke to different generations. You know, are we talking about the 60s, the 70s, you know, post-Saddam? What period was this type of intercommunal solidarity? There was a mixture of approaches. Second narrative, and I think is also a really important one, is that of resistance and resilience. As Moslawis are thinking about the past, they're also resisting the ideology that ISIS enforced upon that city. So while ISIS brought a radical Islamist focus on death and obedience, what we see is a focus on moderation, life, vibrancy, the need to recover local archives, heritage homes, artwork, music. Omar Mohammed writes, my battle since 2014 has been to reverse what ISIS have tried to implant in the consciousness of Mosul's residents with the only weapon I have as a historian, writing history. So in other words, there's this idea, it's not just about a recovery of the past, it's about eroding ISIS hold upon that society, that the ideology is no longer embedded within the community. Now, I think this is perfectly understandable, and I think there's a difficulty for some of the, for many Sunni Arab Moslawis that have seemed to be associated, or in some sense they feel this weight that many people believe that they were involved in collaboration. So there's this attempt to push away from the ISIS discourse. But there can also be a danger that it doesn't go far enough in dealing with past grievances and inequalities that actually allowed for ISIS to arise. Third discourse is the idea of marginalization and betrayal by the state. And this is very prevalent in the narratives of Christians and Yazidis. As one Yazidi activist said, the first blame is towards the Iraqi central government, the government of Kurdistan, because they abandoned the Yazidis. Both withdrew without even firing a bullet against the enemy and left Yazidis on their own to face ISIS. The second blame is on the Arabs that lived in the areas inhabited by a Yazidi majority. They helped ISIS to kill and murder Yazidis. Of course, we cannot make generalizations about all Arabs, but a big number of them helped ISIS, and there are many proofs and indications, such as the mass graves in which Yazidis found their end. There's a very clear, explicit targeting of the state's inability to provide protection But this idea of marginalization and betrayal, which is important to acknowledge whenever we try to think about heritage reconstruction, there's also a sense of loss and belonging and ambivalence at the same time. As one Christian theatre maker said, when Mosul fell, I started to feel a sense of belonging to Mosul. I began to identify myself as a Maslawi. ISIS bombed every part that belongs to our identity. We're now left without identity. We're bereft of our history. So it's not just about betrayal and marginalization. There is an attempt to recover in that forcible destruction. For some minorities, they feel even closer, more embedded into the city, that they want to be part of the city's recovery. I'll hand over to Ina.
Thank you so much. I think after Juliana's presentation today, I don't need to convince you that UNESCO's project of reviving the spirit of Mosul actually came to constitute and to illustrate all of the controversies of large-scale foreign-sponsored reconstruction project. So the rationale in the beginning was, as we heard today, was very much to have a people-centered, memory-led reconstruction process to really revive the spirit, the character, the identity of the city by rebuilding Mosul's religious landmarks. Nevertheless, in interviews with different segments of Maslawi society, but also how the reconstruction process was perceived by populations in some of the hinterland villages, we encountered a lot of criticism regarding the execution of the project. And I have summarized like some of the main critical points. Like the first one was that local experts, engineers, Maslawi architects, anthropologists were not properly consulted, were not properly involved in the process. Others ended up questioning the real motives of the UAE donors. In the eyes of some segments of Maslawi society, UAE is still being accused of having sponsored or having exported more radical branches of Sunni Islam. Another criticism was then about the design for the reconstructed Nuri Mosque, which in the eyes of Maslawi populations was a bit like far too bold, like too modern, and did not really replicate, did not really restore the original spirit, the original character of the mosque. And some interviews also explained that with Maslawi society being more conservative, that they really like wanted to have like what they used to have. They wanted to witness the place that for them was connected to a lot of memories. As one participant was telling us the story how he used to play in the mosque, then he used to go with his Christian friends like who were praying in the church and on the path in between to steal a kiss from his fiancée. So he posed a very emotional question. He said, even if we had like the majority of the original bricks, materials to be used in the reconstruction process, it would be still a new site. Like, how do I revive like these memories, like to this like new visual, whatever like proposition I'm going to witness there as a citizen of Mosul. And last but not least comes this skepticism of elite-led, elite-framed heritage restoration process. With the question of how much thought, like how much investment is being done to enable local communities to resume their normal lives. As one interviews like put it, what's actually the goal or the purpose of rearranging the stones if the soul is missing? So he made a very strong argument that for local citizens to be able to make use of the symbolic value of these sites as part of Mosul's multicultural legacy, they have to have real perspectives for an improved livelihood, which would mean better services, which would mean like the reconstruction of vital infrastructure, and also security and diminishing the role of corrupt non-state and parastate actors in their city. Similar debates also surround the issue of rebuilding the churches. There is no doubt that regardless of their ethnic or confessional background, the majority of citizens of Mosul recognize the churches and their potential like for restoring the city's multicultural heritage. But then again, like others question whether the rebuilding of the churches would indeed facilitate the return of the Christians. So a lot of them, even though they wish for Christian communities to return to the city, they have expressed doubts whether those communities, especially those who have left or were forced to flee, and who now have more comfortable circumstances of living, like more security, better access to services, whether they would indeed like abandon this more comfortable situation in another developed country to go back to Mosul, even if all of the churches were to be reconstructed. And yet another unresolved issue is the reconstruction of sites associated with competing symbolisms. And I would love to give here as an example the reconstruction of the Nabi Yunus site. And again, to quote from our interviews, one of the participants posed the question, with such a site, with such an important symbolic value, like for the city and its citizens, how do you convince the Muslims that there are known Christian and Jewish sites underneath? How do you convince the archaeologists like to respect and to acknowledge the contemporary use of the sites like by Maslawi citizens? And how do you also convince the Christians like of the symbolic value of the sites like also for Muslim communities? So he more or less argued that until we have the right tools, like first to facilitate such a highly sensitive diplomatic discussion with all of these different stakeholders, but also like to find a smart design that would enable all of like these different communities like to use the site, that maybe the reconstruction should be postponed in order not to create divisive historical facts on the ground. And it gets like even more murky when we touch on the topic of dark heritage or sites associated with trauma, with violence. Some interviewees expressed the view that damaged buildings, especially buildings associated with the violence of ISIS, should not be demolished in order to serve as a witness to the ugliness of the ISIS crimes. And others were again anxious that by leaving the material signs of the atrocities that one could witness malign actors exploiting feelings of revenge of the victims, like to incite more conflict and to incite also more polarization within Maslawi society. So for that reason, many grassroots efforts to actually initiate memorialization, to initiate discussions on remembrance, those efforts have sometimes been met with a lot of resistance, also at the federal level, where you have authorities very much keen on protecting the dominant narrative, and also framing like who belongs to a perpetrator community, who belongs like to a victim community. A very controversial topic was also the way one could memorialize the massacre that happened at the site of the Pepsi factory. So on June 1st, ISIS had shot 84 Maslawis who were trying to escape the violence. And then the local community was the one who ended up creating a mural listing in Arabic the names of the martyrs of the Pepsi factory. One of the interviews practitioners actually shared with us his efforts to erect a statue for the women and children who were shot at this location. But he also complained like massively by the lack of political will to support such endeavors, and also like the lack of funding, because it's still like perceived as a ticking bomb, and both international as well as like national actors are a bit afraid of like getting their hands burned like by getting more involved in such controversial issues. Living memories of ISIS atrocities have left deep scars not only on the city's visible infrastructure, but also on the psychology of Mosul's public sphere. And that's why what we take from our field work is that memorialization can also serve as a psychological compensation for the victims, especially like in cases where there is a lot of skepticism whether justice can still be delivered soon through judiciary means. And another ticking bomb yet remains the exploration of the mass graves, such as Hafsa. In some of the interviews, Maslawis also pointed out to the potential of such mass graves and the stories that they could tell. Some even argued that by revealing the DNA of the corpses in such mass graves, one can kind of like help Sunni Maslawi communities to shed like this stigma and this prejudice that they were not equally affected by the savagery of ISIS crimes. So basically like the narrative that they wanted to promote there through the mass graves is that ISIS did not discriminate in terms of ethnic or religious background or sectarian background when it came like to punishing the enemies of the Islamic State. So without further ado, I would like to jump or to summarize some of our policy recommendations, which we address like both at Iraq's international partners and donor organizations, but also specifically at the Iraqi government, at national authorities who also have to do their own homework. So to begin with, what Craig was talking about, this whole idea of reversing herbicide very much reminds us of the idea of resurrection, which means like not just blindly replicating the past, like with all of its inherited, let's say, deficiencies, because this would mean basically, again, reproducing the same grievances, like the same hidden tensions that led to what happened in 2014, but finding a way like to build back better. And this would require also a bolder approach and also a culturally more sensitive approach to enable a communal dialogue about the relations, about like the power dynamics, the dynamics between center and periphery that have in some way like paved the path like to what happened and to what we witnessed in 2014. Another important recommendation is like to explore the potential of smaller projects, especially like those in the field of capacity building and youth empowerment. As a way of linking Mosul's urban elite like to populations in the hinterland. We've also managed to unpack a lot of prejudices like between urban elites and those communities like who for economic reasons like were sought like to pursue a path of social ascent like by migrating to the city, but of course like without having the necessary skills, which like created a lot of antagonism between these two communities. So like everything in the field of capacity building might help mitigate those tensions. To create incentives for the Iraqi government to move back into the driver's seat, because like for reconstruction process, like really to have a sustainable impact and to contribute to social recovery, populations do not have to perceive the international donor community as like their own savior or messiah, but they have to restore like their feelings of belonging to the state and trust like in their own government. So work like with the Iraqi government, create incentives and like still apply like necessary mechanisms of financial oversight. And then last but not least, find practical solutions for displaced populations and like use an incremental process like to kickstart a dialogue about the fate of ISIS families and their potential rehabilitation into society. And to the Iraqi government, I think the first one is the most difficult one, especially as we discussed today in a centralized system where the Ministry of Culture would always be in the center of each and every discussion with UNESCO, how to develop a policy of federal heritage protection and still allowing local communities enough autonomy, like to identify the right mechanisms to restore their own cultural landmarks. Secondly, also very important to prevent any state, non-state or para-state actors from exploiting the feelings of victims and like from trying like to incite a divisive discourse by saying, okay, like this is what happened to your sons, like this is your loss and the state hasn't done anything like to deliver justice to you. Third is, again, like in the field of policy to improve the ways for victims to receive economic compensation from the state and to find incremental resettlement solutions for displaced populations. And last but not least, like to find a way to restore communities' trust in the judiciary, to improve mechanisms of transparency and like to find ways to deliver justice in order like to convince society that it's safe to start discussing like the fate of ISIS families, specifically like to prevent the stigmatization of children currently living in camps and who would be potentially returning to Iraqi society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a very insightful presentation. I'd now like to invite Gruia to take the stage, please.
Hi, everyone. And I guess I should be here. First of all, thank you so much to the organizers, to Noor, for putting this together. I'm very happy to be here. And actually, I wanted so much to come that actually I spent the last 2.5 days traveling. So please bear with my a bit disturbed brain of this lack of sleep and changing time zones. So actually, as the last panel, the panel on emotions, raised some very important points. Maybe I wanted to start with a bit about my positionality. So. Sorry. Oh. Allora. Okay. So I'm Romanian, as my name, for those in the know, might realize from the ESCO at the end. So why would a Romanian be interested in these topics? I grew up in a city that was torn apart by a dictator, which demolished a third of the city for a particular project. I grew up among ruins and grew up with the question of how to make sense of ruins. What does it mean to actually respond to this? What does it mean to heal? Can we even use the word healing? So then, first I looked at my neighbors in the former Yugoslavia, and then to other societies that actually were important to me for also being diverse, place of coexistence, something that my country has lost. So for me, the main question of my work for many years has been, how do we connect architectural reconstruction, dealing with heritage, with this issue of dealing with the past, of dealing with the societal fabric that has been somehow torn? How do they work together? Memory as a way of pushing for a better future, but without, and this is a very important point that you just made, without exploiting victimization, something that the region I'm from is very good at. So what I will do today is actually discussing a very small part of my research, because I'm looking at different actors, particularly architects in my work. But in this case, I wanted to focus on international actors, and actually to focus on these two regions that I'm very interested in, the Balkans and the Middle East. Why? You might wonder, why do I put them in dialogue? Well, they share so many things, from a common Ottoman past, large parts of them, to this idea of coexistence, sometimes eruptions of conflict, also challenges of heritage. People don't like to put them necessarily in a dialogue, but I'm interested in doing that. It's also maybe in a political academic project of bringing more dialogue between the two regions. But also, what I want to do today is also to show that the regions are much more entangled than one might think. And while we heard a lot about how the Middle East is an arena of various international actors, what happens when Middle Eastern actors are entangled in the other place? So I thought, as for instance, in the paper that I submitted, I talk a lot about Beirut, but as today we have so many discussions on Beirut already, I thought of actually focusing more on these particular Balkan examples, so that we bring this dimension of the dialogue together. So, just to start with, in one of the hills in central Sarajevo, you find this teke, which is actually from 2013. It's a reconstruction of a teke from the 1460s. That was one of the first Islamic buildings in Sarajevo, a city created by the Ottoman Empire, in fact, to rule what would be the Bosnia and then Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this building was destroyed and rebuilt various times. And the last time was not during the war in the former Yugoslavia, but actually by the socialist government in 1957. It was rebuilt actually by donations from a town, Selçuklu, in the Konya region of Turkey. And Turkey actually plays an important role in bridging these two regions. Some people consider Turkey to be part of MENA, some people not. But what's important is that somehow it's a glue holding this together. And you can see from this that Turkey is very keen on showing itself in the urban landscape. But the question is why? What motivates different actors to take part? So this is something that I'm exploring in this broader project. So what are the motivations and agendas of international actors to take part in reconstruction? And we heard a lot already today. I will build on that. But then what is the impact of this? What is the impact on, and I focus here on specifically on memory politics. What happens with the existing narratives, the existing local entanglements and complications when you also have internationals coming in? And of course, here we're talking about contested heritage on so many levels. It's not the audience to discuss that. And also we see that post-reconstruction is a specialization of memory between different groups. And I'm interested in how actors actually work across scales, because you have local and national authorities, you have international organizations, you have international NGOs, you have professions such as architects or heritage specialists who come and they also function at different scales. So this is drawn from engagement actually in the last 10 years on interviewing different I think, key stakeholders, but also spending time and seeing how these debates are being shifted. So what I'm interested, again, it's the intentionality, but also the consequence. Because some things might have a particular intention, but they will actually provoke something else in the domestic landscape. And the cities that I examine in the paper are, so one I will not refer today, so the city of Belgrade, where actually the the United Arab Emirates are very present, and we can talk maybe if you are interested in the Q&A or in coffee breaks. But I'll refer to Beirut and actually mostly to Sarajevo. So Beirut, this is a very, it's a very clear example of also of the politics of heritage, how the heritage in this case, in this particular striking image of how the Belle Époque is actually invoked as a raison d'être of the reconstruction that Solidaire has put with this narrative that they wanted to get back as a hub of the Middle East that they felt Dubai has taken over by actually using heritage, something that Dubai did not have at the same level. So the Paris of the Middle East will come back. But then we see next door other forms of real estate, other forms of city making coming to a vengeance. And also, Beirut is also a place of amnesia, in which, and we have here experts on this and how actually officially the civil war at least was not present. It's also a place in which conflict came back and destruction came back. And so while we see international presence in the first reconstruction, there are a number of countries. They're not as many as in other situations, also because of the presence of the Syrian troops. But in this case, after the July war, you have a number of actors, including Qatar, who are involved in reconstruction. But the most prominent one, and the one I will refer later, is of course Iran. The second city, actually the city I will focus more today, it's the city of Sarajevo. So Sarajevo, how many of you have been to Sarajevo? Okay, we have some people, good. So Sarajevo, let's say the local cliche is to present itself as the Jerusalem of Europe. And this doesn't have to do with the current situation of Jerusalem, but with the idea of different religions coexisting. And again, the stereotypical introduction to Sarajevo is, look, a church, a mosque, a synagogue next door. Well, for anyone who knows the Eastern Mediterranean, this is something that's very common in the Ottoman space, post-Ottoman space. But in this case, it's a mark, it's a brand of the city. A city that actually got very transformed, because during the war in the 1990s, the city was under a 3-year siege, which provoked 70% of the city being destroyed, not to the same level as what we saw, but quite affected. It lost its diversity. Now it's a majority Bosnia Muslim city, and then you have the Bosnian Serbs who fled and created actually another city next door. It's also a city that generated, let's say, even the concept of urbicide invoked early, came from a Yugoslav architect, Bogdan Bogdanovic from Belgrade, who wrote about this destruction of cities, and later was theorized by Martin Coward. So it's this idea of attacking cities, also due to their diversity. that was associated with Sarajevo. And if we are to look at this particular building that we saw, the one that became an emblem of destroying cities because it was a library, its reconstruction was a very long, protracted affair. There were many international actors involved, including the European Union, as proudly proclaimed here, also and also governments of Spain and Austria. And what's interesting here is that I would frame that this is an intervention of regret. So we heard also this discussion of what do we do when we talk about a common heritage, and also the heritage of diversity, of living together, being somehow lost. In this case, these actors, as a major journalist at Oslo Bogenia, an important newspaper, said, the international community rushed to reconstruct Sarajevo just to eliminate a bad memory. What bad memory? A bad memory of sitting and letting things happen, of not intervening, of sending a troop just to to look while people were being killed, of letting genocide happen. So somehow focusing on rebuilding what was supposed to be the common heritage was a way to eliminate this. And even if we look at the different documents, overcoming the wounds of the past has the potential to become the catalyst for intercultural understanding in the future. This is the paradigm that at least these actors are functioning. So somehow this fits with also what is dominant at the time, what was dominant at the time in Europe, this idea of the cosmopolitan memory and heritage. That it's about reaching a form of consensus and kind of eliminating the frictions, finding common goals. And reconstruction in a city that's somehow devoid of this past diversity, it's about that. It's about the multicultural person who will build the world. So this is actually a cosmopolitan heritage frame in which some international actors are working. However, I mentioned also that the government of Austria was interested in rebuilding this particular structure. And as an evaluation report by the Development Agency of Austria clearly states, this is it's not about cultural heritage. It's actually about reconstruction as a socio-political thing. It's about peacekeeping and keeping the country stable. And if we are to think about the presence of Austria, or as a matter of fact of Turkey, these were countries that are the successor states of empires that actually ruled over Bosnia in the past. So somehow this is a form of diplomatic presence, but with an imperial history. And what does it mean when the former empire is present, when the former empire is contributing to the reconstruction? So Turkey has been very present in Bosnia, as it was it still is in a number of countries in the Middle East. And maybe just one clue to why that is, of course, we have this discussion of neo-Ottomanism, but also that at one point when Erdogan thanked after one of his elections, he said this is an important election not only for Ankara and Istanbul, but it's also for Beirut and Sarajevo, interestingly enough. So we have this presence in rebuilding, and while declamatory and while in terms of cultural heritage, Turkey is quite present, in terms of investment, Turkey has invested significantly more in Serbia or Bulgaria, countries with a Christian majority and also not with the best relationship with Muslims, that actually with Bosnia that it's supposedly embracing. So, however, this idea of religious solidarity plays a role with other actors. So, in Sarajevo and overall in the Balkans, the reconstruction of religious buildings was very important in also as a form of repair, particularly as, for instance, mosques were targeted, but also churches, but primarily mosques during the war. And so this relates to one of the main actors of reconstruction, and that's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, already in 1992 and 1993, there was concerns about how the West is not doing anything to save the Muslims of the Balkans. So the Saudi state created this High Committee for Assistance, which provided humanitarian I'm shocked. Okay, so anyway, the Saudis were. Just pretend you didn't. Okay. Okay, yes. So in any case, to give one example, the famous Gazi Husrev mosque in Sarajevo was rebuilt as part of this Saudi program, and here came actually frictions with the local preservationist community. This mosque was had a lot of floral elements and things that you can see a lot in not only in Bosnia but throughout Anatolia and so in the Balkans. But the Saudis whitewashed it. It was a very different approach, and this created also discussion: who is bringing what Islam in this, and also the practices created in let's say cultural centers. So the Saudis invested also in cultural centers with a particular form of of Islamic practices, while next door the dwelling remained in these conditions. So it's also this contrast between what is seen as important in assisting reconstruction, and what is also important here is that in all this work, what emerges is an urban regime. The urban regime theory, it's something that comes from political science, in which you see how actors work together to actually reshape urban space. And in this case, the Bosniak member of the presidency, who was an architect, together with a particular Saudi developer, basically reshaped the city. So it was the local aspect here was about entangled with the Saudi actors, and many people in Sarajevo will complain about the transformation of space. As in neighboring Belgrade, people will talk about the Emirates. So somehow it's also competing in different Balkan spaces of this. But as the time is, I will jump over this. There's cities as well involved. Barcelona with this anyway. But But I wanted to also to get to the, of course, I was mentioning the role of Iran, and for the interest of time, I will just mention that if you look at the reconstruction of Harad, and it's there was a lot of interest. Of course, the state was not involved in the way that Solidaire was created as kind of a private-public thing. The neoliberal, the state withdrawal, let stage for Hezbollah to actually work there. But while there's a lot of work about the importance of Hezbollah, what does it mean actually that more than half of the budget came from Iran? And actually, this particular development association is based. It's a response to what actually has been happening in Iran since the Islamic Revolution. So it's actually the know-how comes from there. So it's not only about the money, but it's also about practices and expertise. And we can see the ambassador of Iran in Lebanon said that this is not only about rebuilding and housing, but also it's an instrumental support against Israel. So the rebuilding of Harad was actually a geopolitical tool as well for the country. So just briefly, the idea of actually showing how the local, national, international actors they are entangled, and as example of the Saudi and Bosniak political elites entanglement in reshaping Sarajevo shows this goes beyond scales, connects regions, and so somehow this functions at different scales and rebuilds particular identities. And what I did not have much time to talk about now, it's how they contribute to the dynamics of remembering in amnesia. But it's in the paper, and I'm happy to discuss more. And after your presentation, there's so many things that from the Balkan experience can be actually said, and maybe we can engage in this. So what I hope that this accounted to is just a spark of interest in actually creating this dialogue and showing also how MENA is involved as an international actor abroad. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and sorry I messed your rhythm.
Good afternoon, everyone. You're not sending me that paper. Stops here, right? Okay. Okay. Thanks. Right, so I'll keep a copy of that, no worries. Thanks a lot for hosting us today, and thanks a lot for Doha Institute for Graduate Studies for this amazing event, and really happy to be among all of you today and seeing a lot of faces that I didn't have the chance to see in the UK and other parts of the world, but here we meet, so it's a very small world, so thanks a lot everyone. My presentation today is titled the co-production of memory, the youth vision of Beirut's contested past, where I will explore the notion of co-production of memory with young people in the global south, and particularly I'll be looking into some insights in Lebanon, which is a very close city and place to my heart, where I conducted a lot of research there since 2016. Actually, notions such as youth and participation and justice and empowerment are often used without reflecting the understanding and the relevance of these terms within a particular culture and linguistic framework. And I actually seek in the presentation today to touch base some of these notions concerning how, when, and why participatory heritage might be used, and for young people through a series of research and practice-led projects to develop inclusive and progressive spaces for young people in several spots of the global south, such as Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Kosovo, and many places that I've had the chance to work in. And as we all have different ways and relations to connect with the past, and we all deal with heritage in different ways, and we all understand heritage as a concept that incorporates far more than just the physical features, which could be identified, managed, and controlled as the historic environment in a professional sense. So as an architect myself, I'm really interested in interrogating heritage and memory, not only through the built environment and the physical environment, but also through the people, spatial practices, and their relationship with places and spaces, and hence promoting the value of heritage as a cohesive resource from which the future generations discover where they come from and how they can also navigate the future is really key to a lot of the work that I do. So my presentation today emerged from a project called Recontextualizing Contested Heritage, which was funded by Research England Fund in 2020. Which was a collaboration between the University of Leeds in the UK and the Beirut Arab University in Lebanon. But here comes the question, is that why young people matter and why we are interested in working with young people. Young people really matter because they present over a fifth of the world's population and are mostly ignored in decision-making and planning of economies and societies they will inherit in the future. So, for example, the recent data from the British Council Next Generation Global Research highlighted 3 critical areas of concern for young people. The first is that there is a crisis in education, where young people in conflict countries feel that the quality of education is lacking and does not prepare youth for employment. The second is that there is a crisis in the availability of decent work, whereas unemployment is rapidly growing in conflict cities due to dropping rates of economic growth, with young people mostly hit and impacted by that. And third is the exclusion of young people from voices, agency, and leadership, where they feel underrepresented and face a deep disruption in politics, even where there is newfound democracy. So based on these ideas, we developed a project combining historical inquiry with digital creating platforms to engage citizens with their past and their built heritage. And the overall goal, it was to create a cycle whereby heritage is interrogated by building cultural bridges with the inclusion of key actors, which will in return be strengthened by fostering greater value in cultural heritage. And to support this vision and this agenda, we had 4 specific objectives. First is building new collaborations and international partnerships to support collaborative programs. The second is raising awareness and to promote an understanding of participatory heritage practices and how it can benefit wider communities. And third is building capacity by raising the profile of local expertise to develop practical digital and non-digital skills that would benefit wider cultural sectors. And finally, co-production, and the co-production of the sustainable frameworks and programs to engage key stakeholders in cultural heritage protection. So we lead a number of projects spanning across the global south, as I mentioned, with a wider umbrella to respond to and align with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which represents the aspiration for a more sustainable future. And through the series of projects that we have worked on, we started from the hypothesis that that identity is in part formed by narrated memories of the past and of belonging to one's places. So we ask how citizens could be able to harness new technologies to rebuild new realities, new memories, and new spaces. And here's one example of our ICOM Museum project, where we developed a genuine virtual itinerary to connect 12 forgotten pioneering museums in the crowded city of Cairo, including digitizing their unique collections. We also engaged with several school children in the catchment area of the museums who had no idea of their existence, but we were trying to raise awareness of belonging and emotional connection with their history. In the Living Museum of Qais project in Jordan, we also developed 3 levels of inquiry. First one was on research by recording archaeological sites, tracing historic lives and archives, and recording community stories as well. We also looked at virtual technology by developing technical procedures for virtual heritage and technology. And finally, innovation through working closely with community engagement and developing income generation and policy advocacy. Another example, we also worked in developing a remote archaeological site in South Jordan called Fainan, and we had succeeded in delivering social and economic impact, leading to winning the Newton Prize in 2020, where we worked with the young members of the community to provide an interactive and engaging outdoor museum space that aimed to enhance the informal cultural learning about the history and the cultural heritage of the site. In Iraq also, we worked on preserving the disappearing cultural heritage of post-war Mosul through multiple layers of inquiry and practices. First was on determining the impact of the conflict on Mosul's heritage, contributing to the preservation of Mosul's heritage through digital documentation of buildings and recording social practices and narratives, and also co-producing strategic solutions to manage the preservation and recovery of Mosul's heritage. We also worked on disseminating knowledge, methodologies, and finding for wider public impact through policy documents, guidelines, and exhibitions in collaboration with the British Museum in the UK last year. Another exhibition we held in Jordan in 2021, which was visited by King Charles last year as an example of youth impactful project, well, basically the participation in the process of interpretation rather than its finished outcome has generated a new agency of public contribution to crowdsources, websites, and online exhibitions and archives. And this kind of participatory and co-production interpretation goes beyond the knowledge transfer between individuals, but it also created, a various overlapping memory communities at the same time. Sorry. So we use voices as a research methodology, and by obtaining genuine local knowledge that comes from the ordinary and the original people, they prove their credibility as sources through their ability to articulate complex ideas through arts, maps, and photos. Thanks a lot. So we use arts, maps, and photos in a way that organizes the community's emotions of everyday life and relationships into structured and logical patterns. In addition, voices plays a crucial role in relation to research methodology and co-created outputs. In its simplest terms, voices in research is a methodology and it's data for us. And these voices are analyzed by us as researchers in terms of a broader knowledge of production. Voices also are reflecting opinions, points of views, turn of phrases, or characters in the creative outputs produced by the young people. So the production of voices is neither about replicating stories of people and expecting to hear the same ideas and the same narratives once again, not reproducing consumable narratives of suffering, trauma, and oppression, but we're looking for new ideas and moving forward from there. Moving back to Lebanon now, building on these concepts that I just mentioned and methods of using voices as methodologies, I was interested to explore and further experiment the relationship between the youth in Lebanon and their contested heritage. And actually, by contested heritage, I adopted the definition provided by Historic England in 2021 that refers to historic objects, structures, buildings, or places where the associated stories or meanings have become challenged. So most of us have witnessed how the long civil war in Lebanon and how the conflict resulted in the city's spatial destruction to date. And we also witnessed the August 2020 deadly explosion of the Beirut port, which destroyed remarkable and iconic buildings in the center of the capital, and was followed by local and international campaigns to stop the erasure of social memory, which has been reactivated once again after the explosion. With time, this political instability produced intolerance discourses about the Lebanese youth cultural identities, and war violence remains a significant point around which modern narratives revolve. The echo of years of war and the events that followed emerged as sounds of grief in every building and street and neighborhood to inform the collective perception, knowledge, and awareness of this history. And as researchers, we can hardly escape this imprinted culture given the still standing buildings and public spaces in Beirut that display war memories and reveal the country's political conditions. So we introduced a creative interventions to build the capacity of the youth in Beirut to participate in preserving the city's heritage. We investigated how the process of memorizing history involves overviews and inclusions that fit a temporal setting. We argued that despite the sectarian politics in action, enabling the youth to voice their narratives of the lived everyday contestation could really take apart their substantial contribution to the city's urban development and peacemaking with the past. So the co-production of heritage, what do we mean by that? I use the heritage co-production terminology to ask a simple question. How can we be enabled to make links with our heritage? And how can we connect people with the legacy of their past and to turn personal experiences into sources of inspiration and creativity? How can we provoke curiosity and encourage reflection and take ownership? As I mentioned earlier, the youth are well placed to be trained as facilitators and leaders of ongoing peace-building initiatives. Hence, it is important here to critique the concepts of youth and memory in relation to the context of peace-building initiatives in the global south. So co-production methodologies can have many added values for participatory work undertaken in various contexts with the aim to capture the complex, the sensory experiences, enabling the expression of emotion and revealing the untold stories and narrative. And also co-production vastly helped our research to produce authentic knowledge through creative processes such as producing creative pieces of short films, arts, photography, 360 imaging, VR, and other unconventional research dissemination vehicles. We also used co-production research and digital storytelling to enable the youth to reflect on their individual interpretation of contestation and what elements of the local contested heritage are authentic for them. The co-production and skill-based arts provided access to the youth to empower spaces for co-designing interculture dialogue to address these challenges. As we aim to understand how the post-war youth engage with Beirut's contested heritage, we asked some questions of how they encounter the city, what stories and narratives they tell, and how the remains of war in the city might build their identity and pride in the past. And also how the youth in Lebanon engage with their contested pasts. It was a central question, and it really led to emotional responses that had some ideas of mental study of conflict. So for many, the past is a legitimate vehicle to connecting with the uncertain future of post-conflict cities and underlining the need to study these cities as contested heritage is the vehicle for this. We also developed a research-led interactive platform to build new cultural exchange venues that enable young people and institutions to share and translate cultural responses to ideological conflicts and development of challenges. We conducted 65 interviews with academics from various schools of architecture across Lebanon. 3 focus groups were organized online as a half-a-day seminar and workshop, each group comprised of a mix of expertise and backgrounds from museum curators, architects, practitioners, and activists. The workshops actually aim to strengthen the role of cultural institutions as promoters of human equality and social justice by opening new channels for the youth to echo their voices following years of challenge in fragile state. We worked closely with over 60 youth who engaged in training, documentation, and co-production as a means of participation in generating public memory to enable a growing number of young generations to revisit assumptions of the past and also share these experiences via social media platforms and public display. Well, what did they tell us about their understanding of heritage and how did they interpret that? So most of those young people were born after the war, and the youth do not recognize many scenes of its past in relation to the city's aesthetics and the built environment. So touring buildings and making 360 interactive images and short films, for example, allowed them to develop interpretations of the past as, and I'm quoting one of them, as grasping what they represent provide an opportunity to have a fresh start. The youth need more than ever to stick to their heritage. Thank you. Got it. While the ruins of these buildings and these places induced the most powerful prompt of the memory of contestation, the visual and interviewees displayed provoked discussions about an elapsed past between generations and that do not know much about other experiences during the war. For the youth, the proper channels and tools to express their attachment should reflect their need to engage with the past and communicate with their surrounding and the context in a simple and direct manner. Complicated technologies are unnecessary, except for free tools, applications if needed to communicate with others and share their ideas about the community and the larger community and go beyond that. We also co-produced a culture and impact toolkit that provided a case study model to follow. And our main recommendations that evolved around it was, first of all, to establish partnerships, to build partnerships with core community members and stakeholders, to integrate leadership capacity building as part of the overall capacity training for youth, to strengthen sustainable opportunity for the youth, to raise awareness among university students and early career researchers, and the important use of digital media. So, learning through heritage, what did they tell us back? The methodologies we implemented enabled the young participants to go beyond the collective memory and become more critical and analytical on the basis of identities that they already share. The digital outputs they produced had several positive aspects. First of all, they captured the youngsters' interest in imagination and allowed visualizing narratives of buildings or sites using new media, some of them for the first time. The second is that they enabled them moving into virtual representation of historical and heritage sites to seek sources of evidence that allowed them to make conclusions on the basis of evidence and making their own judgments and building their own conclusions and realize which inquiry process or historical concept they are working on. Third is that the youth learned from the non-symbolic first-hand experience and were encouraged and required to collaborate and provide a societal atmosphere. And finally, these aim to engage young people with the concept of hybridity and the complexity of the history of their nation. So here are some examples. Time is not enough. You can read more about the project in our recent publication, Disseminating the Living Story, Promoting Youth Awareness of Lebanon's Contested Heritage. If you'd like to scan the QR code, it will take you directly there. Also, a lot of more information and detailed information about the project, which was a collaboration not only with Lebanon, but in Iraq and Kosovo at the same time. And we reached creating 3 toolkits and conducting a lot of comparative analysis between them. So also you can visit the website and look at the digital outputs that have been created and hearing the original and authentic stories of the youth in Beirut. Time is not enough to display one of those recorded films that they created, but you can access that through the link there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gehan. You're up.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank the organizers and donors of this wonderful conference. So many enriching discussions so far, and I'm looking forward for what's next. I'm also very much honored to be in this panel with these very exciting presenters that I'm also familiar with their work before coming to this conference. So in my presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about a part of my PhD thesis that was defended 2 years ago, almost. I will talk about the potentials of post-war memorial architecture in Aleppo. So this presentation begins with establishing and arguing for the importance of memorial architecture as psychosocial interventions in post-conflict societies. And then I will address research about design. So basically, I would revisit several examples of memorial projects. And then this discussion would lead to a set of social considerations considering the particularity of the Syrian context and focusing on the city of Aleppo. So in the introduction, I will go through some concepts and some statistics. As you can see, I will go through them quickly to get to the discussion, which would take most of the presentation time. So as we know, war is a traumatogenic event. It causes several psychological consequences. Well, we mostly talk about trauma and the disorders that come with it, such as PTSD. And it is important to note here that trauma is transgenerational. It has been proven to be so. So it doesn't only impact the one person, it impacts its surrounding, its family, and it goes through generations. So it needs to be addressed, and there needs to be some interventions towards that. Especially that such disorders would have very negative impacts, not only on individuals, but also on the society. We talk about increased rates of domestic violence, of rape, of several drug abuse, for instance, and several other social phenomena. So talking about the Syrian context in particular, I came across this survey by the Syrian Directorate of Mental Health, which basically reported the cases between 2013 and 2019 and came up with this result of 700,000 cases. However, it has been noted that these numbers do not really reflect the reality. First of all, because there is a lack of specialists, which count for a few dozen, which is a shocking number. So there aren't enough specialists to report the cases to in the first place. And then we talk about the social stigma that is, associated with conservative cultures, and the fear of people of being stigmatized or excluded if they express their feelings and emotions, and they would report some kind of discomfort. And then there is the exclusion of 6.7 million refugees, since this is a national statistic. And finally, if we look at the knowledge produced by the World Heritage Organization, the estimates of such events, they suggest that 3 to 4% of the population would have severe impacts, which translates into 1 million Syrians, and 10 to 20% would suffer from mild to moderate consequences, which counts to 6 million. So as you can see, from 700,000 to 7 million. Focusing on the city of Aleppo, of course, we need to acknowledge that each Syrian city had its own war history, and we cannot generalize in any way. Each person has their own experience with war, but we can look at Aleppo as an example that shows the intricacy and the complications that social division adds to social recovery and reconciliation processes after war takes place. So as you can see, this is the city of Aleppo with social classes, the divisions that show social class, and then from an urban point of view, you can see that also the urban fabric is not the same. There are several forms of urban fabric, and we need to highlight that these divisions are not new. They are not from the past century, but it has been they have been there for centuries, since early history, and they surfaced more and more during the Syrian war, which has left Aleppo divided and wounded. You can see the statistics. I will not go through them, but you can see also that the division line followed the social class divisions. During the war, there has been several narratives, and each group would come up with labels and specific terminology to describe what's happening. These narratives and labeling are very harmful, and they constitute a big challenge to social recovery and reconciliation if left unaddressed, as the reality suggests now. Okay, I will. So the period that comes after war requires some social and some psychosocial interventions, as well as psychological interventions. So we have the individual level and the society level. At the individual level, we talk about distress, trauma, and other psychological issues. Science and sociology, psychology in specific talk about several methods of treatment, including, and this is what I'm going to focus on, the prolonged exposure therapy, which means exposing the patients to traumatic memories, but within a controlled environment where they can express themselves and deal and cope with these emotions towards healing and eventually and hopefully for post-traumatic growth. This is also mirrored as at the level of the society, and acknowledgement comes as a very important pillar. The acknowledgement of the pain and the suffering of people towards social recovery and reconciliation. And between these two, the prolonged exposure therapy and acknowledgement, lie the memorialization process. And memorialization can, of course, take several forms, including architecture, and this is what I'm focusing on because of my background as an architect. Memorial architecture has been proven to help release the symptoms of PTSD. This is a seminal publication by Watkins, Cole, and Weidman that surveyed American veterans attending the Veteran Memorial and showed how the first few visits may induce really harsh symptoms, but then with several visits, these symptoms would reduce. Now, going back to Aleppo and seeing how the first responses came after Aleppo was recaptured by the government, two memorials were installed in Aleppo, one at the main square of the city, which has a very symbolic meaning to Aleppians, which reads, "I Heart Aleppo," and another one at the Citadel Plaza, which reads, "Believe in Aleppo." As you can see, there is no narrative there, but these memorials come across as a political tool to regain trust and legitimize the actions of the government, as well as to try to make the population believe that the change is coming and things would get better, but unfortunately, and of course, this didn't happen. So the question of this work is, how can memorial architecture advance healing and social recovery in Aleppo amidst the trauma, destruction, and division? A research about design methodology was conducted. I tackled 16 international memorial projects within the theme of post-violence, different types, functions, as you can see, with the aims of seeing which tactics they use to evoke memory and advance healing, which approaches they employed for presenting memory and history, and basically to evaluate how these examples could be relevant to the Syrian context, arriving at a set of social considerations. These are the memorials. So the first broad categories are commemorative memorials and conceptual memorials. The first commemorate an event or a person. The second uses abstract art to convey a message or to illustrate a value or an ideology, or etc. So a bit of theory here, how I arrived at the social guidelines. I started from the goal of social reconciliation with the 4 pillars that has been discussed in peace and conflict studies: healing, truth-telling, restorative justice, and reparation. And reparation include consummation and compensation provided for the society in order to move forward and to feel acknowledged at the same time. So part of the reparation processes is the psychosocial interventions, and for that the social guidelines of inclusiveness, appropriateness, effectiveness are argued to contribute to the goal of social reconciliation. So starting with inclusiveness, memorial projects need to be physically inclusive as well as socially inclusive. Talking about physicality, we need to talk about the design. You can see the needed requirements. In the case of Aleppo, for instance, I argued that memorials should not be only located on the eastern side where most of the destruction took place, but also on the western side to promote and encourage this sentiment of social cohesion and tolerance and solidarity, of course. And then I argue for accessibility, viewing the reports by the World Health Organization that 15% of Syrians have work-caused disabilities. Half of them are permanent. We talk about 80,000 amputees, so we need to acknowledge that when we design memorials. Social inclusiveness has to do with the narrative of the memorial, so we need to exclude the antagonistic approach, which imposes a hegemonic totalitarian narrative and suppresses other narratives. Cosmopolitan approach could be used as it contrasts good versus evil and not really points who's the perpetrator and who's the victim and so on. However, this needs to be very careful because blurring the lines between perpetrators and victims can be very counterproductive for healing and reconciliation. The last approach is the agonistic one, acknowledging socio-political struggles and divisions, and acknowledging that there is a conflicting consensus, that people don't need to have a consensus but need to see each other not as enemies but as parties, as citizens of the same country, and that need to establish democratic dialogues. Regarding appropriateness, we can talk about cultural awareness and relativeness, and some of the presentators have already spoken about the need to understand the society where the intervention is implemented. We need to understand the target audience. For instance, in Syria, there are communities that believe in martyrhood. There are communities that believe in incarnation, for instance. And also, I would highlight heritage as something that, of course, can divide people, but can also connect people. So one option of memorialization is memorializing the loss of heritage, as we can see in the bibliothèque example. Memorials can strike ethnic and political debates. Therefore, the concept of the memorial needs to be really well thought. For instance, establishing a war memorial, a museum in Syria would be a disaster, as we can imagine. So maybe we can think about peace museums, as the Guernica Peace Museum, that promotes a culture of peace and diversity. Timing needs to be thought about as well. The size of the memorial and the budget that is directed to it. We can, for instance, recall the reconstruction of Mostar's bridge that came before other urgent needs, such as the pollution of the river or the refugees that were living in containers at the time. So until that, until the situation settles a bit, we can think about low cost and effective memorials that, such as street memorials that can be distributed around the city. We need also to consider the scale, quantity, and intensity. We don't want people to be imprisoned in trauma and to see trauma everywhere and to be always reminded of trauma. But we also need to have the acknowledgement factor present. So we need an approach that balances between remembering and forgetting. Finally, effectiveness. We can talk about the uncanniness of memorials and how memorials can strike a positive debate eventually. We can talk about the symbolism that memorials incorporate. So here, pain is symbolized by cuts, by wounds. Disorientation is achieved by slanted grounds, for instance. Hope and despair is represented by several levels to descend to the underground, to see the unfortunate events, and then going back up to see the future, for instance, or to have spaces for contemplation and so on. Absence could be tangibly represented in objects that look like coffins, or for instance, or could be intangible by creating an open space. For instance, the roof of Coventry Cathedral doesn't exist anymore. It reminds of the absence of it reminds of the event itself. And then it could be designed, as we can see in the examples. Presence, on the contrary, could be achieved, like the feeling of presence could be achieved by exhibiting personal belongings. The choice of material needs to be also well thought. For instance, the Chapel of Reconciliation, which was built on the site of the Berlin Wall, the site also featured a watchtower. So it was a site of surveillance and violence. And the watchtower was made of concrete and glass. So the first design of the chapel was made of concrete and glass. It was refused by people. Therefore, the materials were replaced by wood and this rammed earth technology, which incorporated the debris of the former cathedral that was on the site, as well as soil and other components. Natural materials symbolize life and death. As we can see in this example, the use of corten steel that oxidizes by rain and weather and peels off, which represents the cycle of life. Reflecting materials, in the case of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, was described as the most powerful element in the memorial by those who attended it, because when they saw their reflection on the wall, it helped them reflect and contemplate, and it helped people also to relate to the events. Deformed materials symbolize the consequences that led to their deformation, as we see in Beit Beirut with the bullet holes on the facade. Colors, I don't need to explain that. Then national and international symbols could be incorporated also to establish connections, whether nationally or internationally. Then we have symbolic monuments that were built or reconstructed for a certain reason. Of course, the Stary Most is not a good example. Spatial arrangements could be used to recreate experiences, whether through symbolic design, as we see in the Holocaust Tower, or through spaces that recreate the experiences through lights and sound, as the dining room at the Guernica Peace Museum, which recalls the bombing that happened. So at first you enter a normal room, and then with light and sound happens, and then the wall next to you reveals the destruction. So it's this is another way of recreating experiences. And then spaces for contemplation, reflection, catharsis. I don't need to explain that. It's very also the use of natural elements to facilitate contemplation, and this one is important. Spaces for rituals, ceremonies, and workshops. The Memorial to Victims of Violence in Mexico allows people to express themselves and narrate their own story and their own loss on the walls of the curtain steel, which would be washed and peeled again, and opening a new canvas for people to express themselves on. And then we have the robbing ritual that was encouraged at the National September 11 Memorial and the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, in which people would rub with a crayon on a piece of paper to keep a copy of the name of their loved ones. So this is the final part. I don't need the paper. Syrian particularities, we can talk about challenges that Syria faces in terms of implementing memorial projects, for instance, or even reconstruction itself, with the political instability, financial obstacles, administrative corruption and inertia, lack of awareness among the society, which needs a lot of work because there is potential misuse of these places, and as well as vandalism. Social reconciliation also has several challenges, and I wanted to focus on the societal trauma membrane that individuals develop during these times of conflict. So it becomes difficult for people to connect with each other because they develop this defense mechanism towards people of other social groups. Top-down issues, neglecting social issues, and as Ammar said in his presentation, that there was no mourning announced, neither during the war or even during after the earthquake that happened recently. And there is also the obsession with political representation in public spaces, as Nur Munawar in his paper has elaborated on. This is a very controversial project that was implemented into 2020 in Latakia Museum that was dedicated to Bashar al-Assad and his sports. That sparked a lot of controversy. And then finally, with this concept of forced top-down reconciliation can be very counterproductive and inefficient, and we need to think of bottom-up approaches. Finally, I wanted to mention that my presentation was mostly focused on state-sponsored memorialization, but we need also to keep in mind that there are other forms of memorialization. There are the unintentional monuments, such as the Statue of the Martyrs in Lebanon, and also monuments can be altered and get and acquire new meanings with time, even meanings that contradict totally with the original meanings of these memorials and monuments. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your papers and contributions. I am so sorry about the lack of time. We do not really have a lot of time, but we do have time for a few questions to go around. So we will take questions from the audience and then give our speakers time to respond. Any questions? I know. Please go ahead. Do we have a microphone? Noor? Yeah, I think
I think you just talk.
Yeah, but a
the translator needs the microphone.
My question is for Dr. Sorry, I forgot your name. Okay, thank you. My question regards the timing of memorialization, because I know that you also wrote on West Germany, and I always find that the Balkans are a good example because you already have like the luxury of a bit of hindsight, but in other ways the conflict is really not that long ago. And in Germany, memorialization became less contagious, less full of conflict, only with time. So I was wondering what ideas you have about how long it takes for a society to be able to narrate their own conflict in a way that is not conflict-ridden.
This is a very important question, actually, because somehow since the 80s, we're talking about this memory boom. So somehow, not only that people talk more about memory, that have more initiatives, you have more academics working on that, but it's also an expectation that societies will deal with a difficult past. So, for instance, when the wars in Yugoslavia happened, there was already an expectation from the international community, whoever that is, there will be transitional justice, there will be tribunals, there will be memorials, but is it so? Isn't it actually more challenging to expect that when people are dealing with so many other things that that they need to produce also forms of memorial? This is why the memorial engagement somehow, if it works in conjunction with something else, with other forms of repair, and I'm very grateful to this last presentation. This is when it's actually working through for other simultaneous projects and processes in societies, it works better. But the problem is we have to question our demand somehow today that we produce memorials, that we produce memory. Because memories exist, but when we actually reify them into memorials, maybe we need a generation. In one of the, for instance, I was doing all these workshops with architecture students in different locations, and in Belgrade, where there's this ruin that's kept there for 15 years, and at the end, after actually a lot of students broke and crying, and one said, maybe it's not our task, in our generation, we cannot really solve this, we don't understand what to do. So maybe we should just accept that there's a need to engage, but sometimes there's not. When at the end, and I will finish with this, in 95, a famous American architect comes to Sarajevo and says, oh, we need to engage, let's do this form of radical reconstruction, we have ruins, and people will wake up there was a rejection of this. People said, we don't want to see this. We want to see the city the way it was, or a better city. So somehow we have to fine-tune this into what people expect and deal with also the needs. Memory is important, but maybe it shouldn't be expected to be right away.
Hi, thanks a lot for great presentations. Maybe my question for Gehan, and maybe other speakers can contribute, but Gehan, really incredible work and really inspiring projects with a wide range of different geographies and different tools, and you focus on a way to raise awareness and the concept of voice, where people can feel like they are heard and listened to, and they are contributing and co-producing. So my question about the choice of geography and partnerships. For instance, some conflict sites, they become very fashionable, such as if we are thinking about Syria, there's Aleppo, or if we want to work in Lebanon, it has to be Beirut or the AUB, or in Jordan, it should be Amman, even without a conflict, but like the choice of where we are working. But like the project that you present, you don't go for the biggest names, for the shortcut for this. I wonder, like, how do you usually choose like the site where you are working which I liked, where you bring like untold stories. And how do you choose your partners? And I think if any of the speakers wish to contribute to the choice of like the science that we are looking at, I would be really grateful. So thank you so much, really incredible work.
Thanks a lot, Ammar. Oh, that's a very difficult question because that's a long story. It would take hours how to choose the partners. It's not easy. I think one of the key ideas is to really tackle an actual problem that will be the driving force of where do we work and who we work with, and actually asking the questions is that when you go to a place and say, what are the actual problems here and what do we want to research? And you're going to bid for a big pot of money, and why do you need to make a strong case of competing with hundreds of other researchers to be successful? I think that's the case. So if the problem is genuine, if the problem really exists and there is a strong case behind it, that's the first thing. So there is always an element of co-producing these projects together with the partners and approaching the right partners. Sometimes we don't succeed of working with the right partner, and we've got plenty of cases out of that. So out of 10 projects, you could be successful in 1 or 2 only, and the other 8 did not work. But we're learning from those experiences, just to address why we didn't get that project, why we're not successful, what went wrong. And even with the successful ones, and I think everybody here in the room knows, it's very difficult sometimes to work in the Middle East, specifically when you want to work on impact-driven projects, where you need to criticize sometimes, higher authorities, like working and I would say that happened in everywhere we worked, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Jordan, everywhere. So sometimes the case is not that it has to be a conflict place, but it's a place that will have an association with a genuine problem and how we tackle that. As I said at the start, I'm really interested in working with local communities. I'm really interested in driving bottom-top approaches to counter, that kind of centralized ways of planning our cities, renovating our cities, dealing with the communities, and having, getting communities and marginalized communities in particular to have voices. So how do we navigate to drive that? So that's one of the main issues here. We do work with higher authority governments sometimes. We were in Jordan, in Iraq as well, in Egypt, in Lebanon. We succeed in some places more than others, but again, we keep trying as much as we can, and that will be the whole thing. But yeah, I hope I answered you.
Maybe I could just add, I think also pragmatically, it's access and funding. So much of this is based on funding, and when funders want to be very explicit on, this is the group that you're going to, there isn't flexibility very often within the project. I think that's reflected in heritage projects, that already this sort of conclusion and results are, they're upfront rather than allowing them to evolve. And that becomes much more difficult. I think there are opportunities. I've found in work, the challenge is to move research in Lebanon, to move beyond Beirut to Tripoli. Recently I was doing interviews in Arsal, in the Bekaa. It's much more challenging, but there are, there's lots of marginal voices. I think, if you want to, you need to look at better access, more flexible funding, and pragmatic approaches to doing that type of research.
Also, just to add one thing as well, Ammar, I think one of the big challenges we face is our credibility as researchers when working with those partners abroad. And I would just quote one of our partners saying that we are seen as temporary projects. So we just show up for a period of time, we generate great things with them, and then we disappear. So I think there's a problem for us is the sustainability of that impact and that work and how to keep it on. And unless you're successful in generating income once again to carry on and build on the existing work, I think that becomes a little bit challenging. And so they start to see you as, oh, you're going to be here for 2 years and then you disappear, and then another team will come into. So I think that kind of momentum of sustainable impact and sustainable delivery is very important for them to create that kind of trust and credibility.
And just to add what you have said, I will use Sarajevo as an example with sponsorship from Saudi Arabia. If we will take the money from the Saudis just to reconstruct and to build the Islamic culture in Sarajevo, where the majorities are Muslims, and we do not take care of the minorities who live there, then actually we just turn fuel on the fire. We don't protect the cultural heritage, we just create extra problems. So if in a way we can convince, for example, the Saudis, this is part of the cultural heritage of Sarajevo for the people who live there, inclusive everyone, then maybe they will change their mentality a little bit. And this is one example, and we can speak about thousands of them. Thank you.
If I could reply to this, so actually, this actually happened. There were a lot of reactions, even to the Turkish. There was this post-imperial, particularly from the Bosnian Serbs, saying, "Oh, look, the Turks are back," or "Look, the Saudis are contributing," which contributed to the narrative during the war of they said they were the ultra-nationalist Serbs saying this will be a jihad, and they said, "Look, now they're coming." But if we look at in Lebanon, if we look at actually Iran, Iran is doing what you're saying. Iran is not only didn't just go into Haret, but actually there are valleys in the center of the countries in which Rum, so Orthodox populations receive. They have the projects that Iran is conducting. So Iran is also having this narrative where we're here for everyone. So it's so it depends on how these international actors are looking at things.
All right, then I think because time is running up, we're going to have a 10-minute break. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much for our speakers for their interventions today.